My daughter's boyfriend made a costume. I saw how the costume was over his face and wondered how he'd breathe. Then it occurred to me, what's the part of the costume that superheroes cut out? The mouth, so that they can breathe. So what would the opposite of a superhero be? According to the BBC, US birth rate falls 4% to its lowest point ever. In the article we read, the American birth rate fell for the sixth consecutive year in 2020, with the lowest number of babies born since 1979, according to a new report. Some 3.6 million babies were born in the U.S. in 2020, marking a 4% decline from the year before, found the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC. So what does this mean? I mean, what's behind the crash? Some articles are drawing attention to the pandemic, but there are deeper underpinnings. One that almost no media outlet will talk about is the fact that real wealth in a society correlates with how many kids you can have. Adam Smith said in 1776, "But though North America is not yet so rich as England, it is much more thriving and advancing with much greater rapidity to the further acquisition of riches. The most decisive mark of the prosperity of any country is the increase of the number of its inhabitants." Smith was right. America was getting richer, and its wealth was showing in the fact that America was outstripping everybody for population growth. Around the 1790s, economist Thomas Malthus noticed this. He wrote that the population of Europe took 400 years to double, but he added that the American colonies were quite different, writing, "The consequence of these favorable circumstances united was a rapidity of increase probably without parallel in history. Throughout all the northern colonies, the population was found to double itself in 25 years. Then he talked about the freedom and the people's ability to keep most of their earnings and added, "With these extraordinary encouragements to population and every cause of depopulation as we have supposed removed, the numbers would necessarily increase faster than in any society that has ever yet been known." So America had real wealth. How did we know? Because they could afford to have a ton of kids. Unlike in England, where families would routinely abort their kids because they didn't have the resources to have big families. Today, the government tries to hide the fact that for the average person, prosperity is going down. Instead of measuring national well-being in terms of how many kids a family can have, they switched it over to GDP. The problem with GDP is that it's mostly fake. The old saw is that if Bill Gates walks into a homeless shelter, the modern economist would say the average wealth of everyone in the shelter was $500 million. Once Gates walks back out of the building, however, the net worth of the hobos inside collapses back down to zero. So with GDP, you can have a small oligarchical class amassing massive wealth with everyone else getting poor, and you can hide it by relying on fake averages. Today, average people can't afford to have large families, with millennials and Zoomers not having any families at all. According to Mark Penn in his book, Microtrends Squared, they all have dogs instead of children. They can't afford to have families because they're strapped with student loan debt and mired in poverty. This is, of course, reflected in the tumbling birth rates that the media will never tell you are a thermometer for the real state of the economy. Historian Joseph Tainter talks about social collapse and explains how one of the main contributing factors to the fall of the Roman Empire was the growth of government and the overtaxation of the population to pay for it. Because the people couldn't afford to have children, the population went into decline.
The tax rates were so high that peasants were not able to accumulate reserves or support large families, and this is why population did not recover. And one reads horrifying accounts of peasants actually selling their own children into slavery because they couldn't feed them, or going to the cities to look for food because they didn't have any left for themselves on their farms. With these sorts of problems, marginal lands went out of production. They simply couldn't yield enough for taxes and a surplus. Even though the government didn't allow this, the government continually tried to force farmers to cultivate all of the land. And then, of course, there were continued fiscal problems, as you would expect.
Tainter adds one final note in summation.
So, what was the cost to the Romans of being sustainable? Because this is what they were trying to do. They were trying to sustain their empire as a political institution, and also they were trying to sustain Greco-Roman civilization, which they saw as being threatened. The reforms were very costly because of the increase in complexity. The empire taxed citizens very heavily, conscripted labor, and regulated occupations. Peasants couldn't pay taxes, so often they would abandon their land and go to work for a wealthy landowner who would then protect them. Lands were abandoned and population declined, and the wealthy often got themselves out of paying taxes.
Yes, the wealthy got themselves out of paying taxes, which is why their wealth grew while everyone else's net worth collapsed. Kind of like how the fortunes of a handful of oligarchs have exploded, especially after the pandemic. One meme going around says, the wealth of Jeff Bezos in 2009, $6.8 billion. In 2021, $200.9 billion. The wealth of Mark Zuckerberg in 2009, $2 billion. In 2021, $135.2 billion. Minimum wage in 2009, $7.25. In 2021, $7.25. Yeah, you can imagine now why the government and media no longer calculate wealth in terms of how many kids the average person can afford to have, but by GDP, and that's just the way that Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg like it. Before you is a moral puzzle. If you push this button, something advantageous will happen for you. But be warned, if you do, a pompous elitist who you do not know and who you will never meet will be heckled mercilessly. The choice is yours. Choose wisely.